So welcome to Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I'm with Dr. Michael Lewis. And Michael Lewis is University Distinguished Professor of Pediatrics and Psychiatry and Director of the Institute for the Study of Child Development at the Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. He is also Professor of Psychology, Education, and Biomedical Engineering at Rutgers, which is the State University of New Jersey, and serves on the executive committee of the Cognitive Science Center there. Dr. Lewis is a fellow of the New York Academy of Sciences, the American Psychological Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. He is the recipient of the Yuri Bronfenbrenner Award for Lifetime Contribution to Developmental Psychology in the Service of Science and Society from the American Psychological Association, and the Distinguished Scientific Contributions to Child Development, that award from the Society for Research in Child Development. Dr. Lewis has written over 450 journal articles and book chapters, as well as 35 books, including Social Cognition and the Acquisition of Self, Shame, the Exposed Self, and Altering Fate, Why the Past Does Not Predict the Future. Today, we will be speaking about his most recent book, which integrates his lifetime of work on the emotions and consciousness, and it's called The Rise of Consciousness and the Development of Emotional Life. It's an extraordinary honor for me to be speaking at length with Michael Lewis because he's had a profound influence on my work over the decades. I'm very grateful for his research and writing, his discoveries about the self-conscious emotions, and the resulting ideas about human consciousness and the self. His overall philosophy of human development also has undergirded my books and teachings since I encountered his work in the mid-1980s. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
And today we're going to be talking about this book, The Rise of Consciousness and the Development of Emotional Life, and we will be posting this in the interview. But it was wonderful to read it. And my only difficulty was that I couldn't pick out what to talk about because it's got so much material that I'm so interested in. And so originally I contacted you to talk about shame-based disorders and about shame, and to be able to articulate how shame is different from depression and some of the things that it gets confused with, especially from an everyday kind of point of view as well as clinical practice. But as I read the book, I realized that, and I remembered again, how all of your work is contextualized in the whole framework on what human consciousness is. So, I'd like to start with talking with you about consciousness in the human self. And since your book is so good at framing the big issues, I'm going to begin each one of our separate sort of topics with a quote from the book. And so I'm going to start with this quote, which is on page 88. And this is what it says. This is what I think of as consciousness, something that knows itself and knows it does not know all of itself. This self of mine, then, is greater than the me being only a small portion of myself. The idea that I know is not the same as the idea that I know I know. The explicit aspect of the self that I refer to is that which knows it knows. Now, this immediately takes me back to my roots in Piaget and the process of decentering that the child does in its development. But as we talk about this part of your work, please tell us how you arrived at this definition of human consciousness, that it's more than a knower. It's the knower that is conscious of itself. So I know I feel, I know I hear, I know I see, I know. This kind of, reflexive circular aspect to our consciousness as humans is really different from the consciousness of the other beings here on Earth, and certainly sets us apart from the plants, because I've had many people say to me, oh, the plants are conscious. And I say, no. I would say they're sentient and they respond to their environment, but consciousness has this circularity. So talk to us about how you came to this idea, as well as your incredibly iconic experiments with the babies, the 18-month to 2-year-olds that you put rouge on their nose, and the whole world changed after you did that. So please, let's go into how you came to this idea of human consciousness, as well as how the human self develops out of it, and your research on the babies with the rouge.
That's quite a task. 60 years of work. Briefly, let me see how I can reconstruct. Historically, I could begin. Back certainly at the beginnings of psychology, when it emerged from the German, what we call brass instruments, behaviorist tradition, essentially did not have an organism. They had stimuli and they had responses, and somewhere between things happening and people responding to those was an organism. And in fact, the early theorists had that O in it, the organism, between perception and cognition or action. But nobody could do much with it. In fact, I can say even today, although I feel consciousness is a central task in the psychology of human behavior and development, it is still an area full of questions, controversies, different techniques, and one has to be very careful of what one means by consciousness. To top it all off, we know things that we don't know we know, or we don't know things that we don't know we know them. Now, those of you who are political astute know that during the Bush administration, there was the Secretary of Defense.
Rumsfeld,
who actually gave a talk on there are things knowable, there are things known, not knowable, there are things not known, not knowable. And he played with something which I had written 2 decades before already, but he was trying to capture as an excuse errors, his way of apologizing. I don't think he really was much capable of doing that directly. But in any event, we are confronted with all sorts of things. But one thing is very certain, is that I know something about myself. I know what I look like. I know how I sound. I know I don't look like I used to look, and I don't know how I will look in the future. So what cannot be, what is inescapable is that we know something about ourselves. The problem comes in when we start talking about unconscious, when we start talking about subconscious. We are starting to talk about knowledge. We're starting to talk about what is it that we know, or what is it that we know we don't know.
Yeah.
And to talk about consciousness means that we're going to have to talk about all of these things. Now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, our thrust today, as we suddenly discovered we can measure things in our skull, is the movement of the argument about consciousness into brain function.
Right.
Whether or not brain function and consciousness bear any similarity, we don't know.
Right.
Philosophers try to deal with as diverse views as a machine will never have consciousness, because the machine is not made up of the biological material that humans are made up of. Two, just the opposite argument, that if you cannot tell you are talking to a human or a machine, then it doesn't matter. So we go the full gamut. So where we are is pretty clear. We are at the beginnings of something wonderful. I certainly don't intend to live as long as it will take to someone telling you and everyone agreeing on what consciousness is. I suspect as a number one problem, it would take a long time. So there is that problem. I always believed that humans were not automatons on the one hand, yet on the other hand, certainly in very early childhood and in infancy, I was unwilling, and the evidence did not support the idea that they were the same as adults. So when the mother says to me, my child is frightened, she's meaning the same thing as she would say to me if she said, I am frightened.
Yeah.
And what became apparent is of whatever it is that's going to be, it's going to take place in two ways. One is a maturational way. There are clearly brain changes, and we tried to explore some of this. And also, there is a social environment. So any theory of consciousness is going to have an explanation, which is a self-reference and knowledge about oneself, that there is things we know we don't know and don't know, and in fact don't know we know. So all possibilities of that exist, and that what it is we are consists of two parts. A being who is capable of asking oneself what one is, and a culture which helps to define what it is we are.
You know, I've talked to a number of scientists and a number of theorists, and one of them is Donald Hoffman, who is the cognitive scientist and psychologist who does something called conscious realism in his investigations. But he, as you know, David Chalmers, the philosopher, and a lot of people in the field right now that intersect with, let's say, AI, machine learning, and so on, he he wants to solve the hard problem of consciousness in his particular way, which I respect a lot. But when he refers to consciousness, and it's the same when David Chalmers refers to it, or I can't really remember the other philosopher that I've listened to quite a bit. Daniel Dennett maybe, or somebody. Yes. They refer to things like this: the taste of vanilla, the feeling of your foot hitting the ground, or your desire for this or that. In other words, what they refer to are these qualia, these kinds of experiences. They don't refer to knowing those. They leave out the circularity, like, I know the taste of vanilla. I know that's vanilla. I'm tasting something. I know I'm tasting something. I'm feeling something. I know I'm feeling something. It's as though that distinction has dropped away in some of the philosophical discussions and has made it so much more confusing, because what they're calling consciousness in these qualities of experience, those kinds of experiences are obviously available to other kinds of animals, sentient beings who are not human, who can distinguish taste, who have languages, who do a lot of things, but they don't do this thing that we do. And it's been hard for me to understand why we've lost ground in being able to even talk about consciousness, and I wonder if it's because people are no longer developmentalists, or I don't know, I wondered if you could comment.
It's hard to say. The issue of consciousness has been around. Certainly one can go back to James in
Yes.
1895 and his principles of psychology and find, and we could go back earlier. There is no question that our experience tells us something about the world, but it also tells us something about ourselves.
Sounds right.
I don't see consciousness as a content. I see it as a process. So those people, brain researchers, are trying to look at process in the brain to try to see if there was some process at work. So one of the mysterious things that emerge is that you find people act faster than they should if the brain is causing the action. It is almost as if the action is. So this turns out to be very important in my own thinking about the problem, because I want to embed consciousness, this process, into the developing child. So while I'm not going to talk about animals, we could, or rocks, or plants, or invertebrates, all of which are alive. Well, that's right, rocks are not alive. Excluding rocks. So what I want to do is to talk about us, this Homo sapien, starting off as a thing, in fact, very similar to what I call a capacity of action patterns. Now, that was a phrase that Darwin picked up on. If you wanted to sneak in the word instinct or predetermined, as long as you don't make them hard and fast and unchanging rules, what we have is an organism has to come into this world and act. It means breathing, it means sucking and ingesting food, it means seeing, it means defecating, okay, all of these actions, all of them are action patterns. None of them are learned. They are simply not learned.
That's right.
So for me, from a developmental perspective, I am dealing with the infant as animal, if you will, to the child as small person, to the adult as Homo sapien. That's our mature self. So one could jump from animals to humans. I don't have high regard for that literature because we make the incredible mistake of assuming that it is like us, therefore having us, our capacities as an adult. So when the baby cries, we say the baby is unhappy or sad, or maybe even angry, depending upon the situation and depending upon our belief of what that situation and behavior is called in our culture. So, for example, if you look at how Japanese and American babies respond to inoculation and how mothers respond to their child's pain, what you find are very little differences between Japanese and American children, but big differences in Japanese mothers and American mothers.
Yeah, right.
So, so let's come back to the kind of thrust where I think, do I see it more clearly? I only wish, but the fact is, what I'm dealing with from a developmental point of view is a child who has action patterns in the world, okay? I have a sucking reflex. If I'm hungry and something touches the side of my cheek, I will turn my head toward it. If something is placed in my mouth, I will suck on it. Unlearned behavior.
Right.
And I can go on and on. Chicks, baby chickens and humans have a numerosity, have some concept of something being more than something else.
Right.
Okay? These are not learned. So these are
Right.
action patterns. However, when we do these, we as adults, they may no longer be action patterns, but intentional, conscious or unconscious actions.
Right.
So I wrote a paper in 1967 saying why developmental scientists need to be Oriental metaphysicians, because the same behavior seen in the infant and seen in the 4-year-old are very different meanings.
Yes.
A baby may cry simply as an action to discomfort, pain. A 3-year-old can cry to get attention or to indicate they're sad and so on. They're both crying. They're not the same thing. So part of the error that I think is made is when we see similar behavior across animal and across human, we assume that the animal and the human are equivalent.
Yes.
I want to dissuade us of that view, and I come to it from a developmental perspective.
Right.
Which gives me the advantage of having the same creature embedded in a particular culture that undergoes maturational changes and also undergoes changes in terms of the processes which lead to behavior. I know this sounds very abstract, but it's not. So let me finish the quote that you so nicely mentioned in your introduction. I have 4 stages of knowledge. So I'm going to be an epistemologist. I'm going to talk about knowledge. What is it that we know? Now, interestingly, some of the same problems which the child has to become an adult, unfortunately, turns around and starts to have when you get older. That is, the decline has some similarity to the onset. Yes. So, yes. So I'm going to suggest that there are 4 kinds of knowledge that the child has. From the beginning, it starts with I know, just as you suggested, I said, meaning simply that I know things about the world. Who knows it? I don't have an eye. The organism knows it. A rat knows when it's running to a wall, not to crash into it. It never crashes into the wall. Right before the wall, it turns sideways. We can say of the rat that it knows. It's that kind of broad knowledge. It's not experiential. It is knowledge which the organism has. We have an onboard computer, which is an extraordinary device.
Well, so let me just say one thing there that might be helpful in, these action patterns or these innate releasing mechanisms or these design features or whatever. I'm a longtime practicing Buddhist. And so from a Buddhist perspective, that the idea that the self is separated out, or that, it's like the entire, how do we want to say it? The infant and the rat are born into a context and conditions that they're a part of, so it's like we're designed especially for the environment, the way that we grasp and suck and push and so on. It suits the environment that we're coming into, and the design works such that when we're in a particular situation as an infant, we have a particular response. And like you said, that becomes knowledge. And the brain changes and builds on that knowledge, like that when I turn my head and I reach the breast and I get something good, then there's no I there, but that organism is changing in the same way that the rat would be changing if it confronts something that looks like a wall but is not, etc.
I would suppose that the Homo sapien, and may even be the Neanderthal or Davidians or all of our cousins. It probably goes back much further. That there are action patterns which are more unique by organism. So that a mother rat will build a nest. If you disrupt the nest, she'll build the nest again. I don't know anything comparable in human mom, but it may well be. She could be painting the nursery a color, and then if it disappears, she'll have to go paint it again and not realize that it was painted before or so on. So yes, we can make that distinction. But again, I don't want to deal with rats, only to suggest that living organisms possess knowledge.
Yes.
Which I indicate by the statement, I know. Now, there is no I. That is, it is known. Would probably be a closer. All righty. What emerges is a unique form of knowledge called a meta knowledge or meta representation. And the first one of those is essentially an I. I know, okay? So, and I'm going to try to date these in terms of not an evolutionary point of view, although I've tried to do that as well, with self-recognition and mirrors. But this second is the same as that the difference between a memory and a remembering that memory. I remember. As you know, our experiences when we see pictures of ourselves in early childhood, clearly before we have any good memory storage, is we remember we've seen that picture before. We don't remember being that age. So that 2-year-old boy with curls sitting on a coffee table, eating something that their mother gave them, I have seen that picture many times. I have a memory of that memory. I actually don't have the memory.
Right.
I have a memory. So I have a meta representation. Now that is a massive change. From an evolutionary point of view, the difference between species, but certainly in human beings, that moment when suddenly there is a representational self that emerges, it doesn't yet have qualities. The I am. Sorry for
you're in New York.
New York.
Yeah.
So, certainly, if we could mark that moment, we should see massive changes taking place along the social, the cognitive, and the emotional domain of this growing organism. So the second is some representation of some of the things which we were doing that we can now represent. I don't know I'm a male. I don't know if I'm a female. I don't know if I'm little or big, but I'm going to quickly acquire features of myself that I know. So to begin with is the process, but very soon, looking in the mirror, having mirror experience, I come to see, hey, that in there is me, as we do a Zoom. So the third is now a social moment, which is I know, you know. All of a sudden, there are other people around me, and I need to gain the knowledge that they have something similar to what I have. Because as soon as you have that, it allows you to move toward empathic behavior.
Yeah.
Gee, you have this kind of face in this situation. If I had it, and you have it, then I have some idea of what you are like.
Yes.
But it's the fourth one, which I like most, and really started first and from a historical point of view. There happened to be a professor of education in Dublin. What he wrote a book called Knots, Knots.
Oh, it's R.D. Laing?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a book of poetry, essentially filled with recursive sentences. And so the fourth stage for me became, I know, you know, I know.
Right.
So all of a sudden, this knowledge is not only knowledge about myself, it's knowledge about you, and it's knowledge that you know something about me. That recursiveness brings it back to me. So
Right.
my consciousness is not made up of only my experiences and my action. It's also made up of my knowledge about others through empathy, which in turn supports my knowledge about myself. So that fundamentally, from an epistemological point of view, you have to develop this, I don't want to call it conscious, because consciousness is a very strange concept. Consciousness is when I refer to myself, when I think about myself, when I need myself to act or feel in a certain way in the world. However, I don't do that all the time.
Right.
Consciousness is distributive. So we have to get past the idea that we are always conscious and that all information coming in is coming in, because it isn't the case. We are already selecting things based on principles about ourselves, which we may or may not be aware of.
Just like in that moment where you know that it's in Ireland, and you know that this other thing about it's the name of the book, etc. It's I believe that recursive move is often connected with what we call consciousness. And you're right, mostly we're doing things automatically. The knowledge is not something we're checking on. We're just kind of moving along. In fact, the cognitive scientists say, we're about 99% unconscious. And what they mean is working memory, that we actually know what we're doing or saying even. But those moments that are recursive, where we do, say, I know that, or I know that I felt that, or I know that I smelled that. Those are moments, I think, that are significant for what I would like to see as consciousness, and as the infant develops that capacity to reference something that we call self, and that appears to be some kind of coherent subjectivity. I mean, it's never completely coherent, but there's the recognition of something that's somewhat coherent in a mirror. That, and that the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan also deals with that issue of recognizing the subjectivity in a mirror. He has a different approach to it, but he's after the same thing, which is that, it takes us quite a while to put together something like a coherence. And we don't have that at the beginning of life.
Sure. No. And in fact, it was one of the big arguments that Freud had with many of his disciples, interestingly enough, which was that Freud said that many of these, what he calls defenses what we might call ego control things we were not born with.
Right.
Freud believed that the self emerged, much like
Right.
Mailer did,
Yeah.
although her student, Dan Stern, did not. And Dan argued
Yeah.
firmly against the fact that so there have been interesting people dealing with that issue.
Yeah.
Let me mention from a more empirical point of view, one of the things that drew me to the use of mirrors as one way to try to get at consciousness.
Was that your idea?
Yeah. Oh, I'll give you the history of it.
Yeah.
The mirror work I'll go back to, but I want to give you. So I made the observation with my children that my children, as babies, were frightened or certainly wary of other adults they didn't know, but quite amazingly were very happy and interactive with children they didn't know. So not knowing something, what's called stranger anxiety, which is a poor term for it, was in fact not restricted to strangers, but only certain kinds of strangers. So I have now a 9-10-month-old infant who, when approached by an adult, male or female stranger, shows suspicion. They stop what they're doing. They're going to watch what's going to happen. Whereas if they're approached by a 3-year-old or 4-year-old child in the same way, they smile and laugh. So we did a whole series of studies publishing showing that children were fearful of certain types of strangers, namely adults, and they were also more frightened of male adults who were strange than female, but not more frightened of male children, 3-year-olds, than female. So, and we've replicated, it's a well-known fact that children are not frightened of strangeness, they're frightened of strange adults. Well, what the heck does that mean? So then we designed a study. Now I'm going to use the language of the paper. It was a paper about children's fearfulness toward midgets. Midgets is pejorative now, but it meant a small person, well proportioned, but small. And so we did the only study in the literature where we had adult male and females, children male and females, and a single adult midget. The midget is the same height as the child, but the facial configuration is an adult face, whereas adults are both taller and different faces than children. So we wanted to know what these babies were responding to. It turns out that height was one of the dimensions, which led my pediatrician colleagues to not stand up when they interacted with children, but to sit down at eye level, which tends to relieve some of the fearfulness. But the male-female difference beats the heck out of me. I have no idea why adult males are more wary than adult females to young infants. I can't explain it. It exists out there, and it's true. What was interesting is that they already had a good idea of what looked like them versus what didn't look like them. So then we did a study in which instead of people moving toward the child, sitting up in an infant seat or a crib, slowly moving toward them and smiling, we had a mirror move toward them.
Oh, okay.
And lo and behold, they responded to that mirror like it was another child. not
Uh-huh.
another stranger. So
Right.
all of a sudden it occurred to me, my God, they have some representation of the mirror. Now, I won't go into the details of it, but let me go back to some of the work in the primate literature that I was familiar with. There was a study on chimpanzees on mirror recognition. I later discovered that Zazo, Z-A-Z-Z-O, a French psychologist, also had done some mirror studies. But what they didn't do, which was done with chimpanzees, was they put the rouge on their nose, they were anesthetized. Then they woke up. They had mirrors in their environment, and lo and behold, the baby chimp or the adult chimp would go over if they had rouge and touch their nose. So there was a technique had been developed in the primate literature, and I said, wow, this can be done. So going back into the late 60s, the early 70s, we started to look at mirrors. Then we realized, well, okay, we can see when the child starts to look in the mirror and touch their nose. Led us in two directions. One, what does it look like over the first couple of years of life, just to get a handle on what's going on? And what we found is that before 15 months, putting the child in front of a mirror, you don't get any response to the mirror. If any response, you get what is animal-like, namely, you think it's a conspecific and you approach it either snarlingly or socially. But at 15 months, about 15%, let's say, of children developing typically show nose-directed behavior. The interesting thing about the phenomena is once it emerges, the child always has it. Doesn't start and stop and so on. The second thing is that you can't teach it to the child. The child doesn't point to its nose when it sees the rouge. The mother can put rouge on her nose and say, point to the mother's nose with the rouge. The kid has no trouble doing that. Now you put the kid's attention back to its image in the mirror and it doesn't touch. If they touch their nose, they're going to do it in the first 3 to 5 seconds of seeing themselves in the mirror. They do it instantly.
Would you say then that it is that they are seeing visually something that's coherent? I mean, so they're noticing right away, this is different from what it was. I think what what I feel is kind of useful about the idea of that visual thing being different from what it was is this idea that it's some kind of whole image. It's not just a bunch of things, so that maybe they could see the body of the mother like this, and then they couldn't see it as a two-dimensional image. So I wonder if that's
Well, it's a moving image, first of all, since it's a mirror. By the way, we did a book published in '79 that you had mentioned, in which we looked at many techniques, not only the mirror, looking and seeing if you have rouge on your nose. It's not the rouge on your nose, it's the saying that image there in the mirror is located here in space, and that's my nose.
So it's the spatial, but it's not, let's say, the visual comparison of one without the rouge to one with the rouge. It's the
Well, we
spatial.
actually did those experiments as well in the
You
book,
did.
where we had put the child, we rubbed the child's nose, but put no rouge on, put it in front of the mirror, and the child wouldn't touch the nose.
I see. So
They do it. Then at the same time, we got interested in delayed development. And so we started to look at the literature in children with developmental disabilities. Typically, children go from about 15% of them at 15 months to 100% at 2 years of age.
right.
If a child, if the pediatrician should use this as a screen. And being
Yes.
a distinguished professor in pediatrics, you would think I could have an influence, but there's no billing number for this test. Therefore, they don't do a test because they can't get paid for it. And I'm not trying to be pejorative. I'm just simply, they have too many things to do and they don't do it.
Because
But
it is a discriminating test, like you
if
said.
in 2 years you don't touch your nose when you have rouge on it in the mirror, or don't say, "Mommy, red nose," or something, you have a problem, and that's exactly what the literature shows. Enormous amount of studies with children with autism, children with attention deficit problems, children with
Asperger's or not? Asperger's.
no,
is something.
Asperger's don't have a problem. Asperger's are fine.
That's what I thought you said in the book. And so it's
any
really,
cognitive
it's
decline.
autism spectrum disorder, and that, and other kinds of Down syndrome and so on. I think you said, I can't remember which ones you, Down syndrome. Okay.
And many disorders. You need a mental age of 15 to 18 months to be able to recognize yourself in a mirror. Now, we did studies to see, because there was a problem with infants, which most people don't concern themselves, which is infants like to look at other infants and smile at other infants, pictures of them, so that simply looking at their emotional response was inadequate to get to what we wanted, namely that the child had a representation of itself in space and time, and knew that it could touch its nose with the mirror. So now we had a technique, but to hold an elaborate theory of consciousness on a single measure is always problematic. So we sought other measures to use. And it turns out, you don't have to look very far, personal pronoun, me and mine. Okay? Mothers don't use personal pronouns. They don't say you or me. They say mother if they're referring to themselves. Yet, by 2 years of age, out starts to emerge personal pronouns. Me, mine, in particular. I emerges somewhat later. And there are some interesting linguistic problems with that, but we'll leave that aside. That's not for a discussion.
Does no emerge at about the same time? I mean, it seems that with my children and so on, I noticed that no and me and mine all emerged kind of
Terrible twos.
Right.
It actually is coordinated very well with mirror recognition. So now I have a language referral, which grows, and we don't know where it's coming from. I mean, it hasn't been solved, but it certainly comes at the same time that you recognize yourself in mirrors. And finally, the third thing, which we can thank Piaget, which is the ability of pretend. Now, I'm working on a paper on pretend, on imagination and so on, because pretend is very much a self-conscious act. Example, I pretend that this pen is a helicopter spinning around. Now, if I believe it's a helicopter, I have a delusion and I'm delusional. But if I know it is not that which I am saying it is, notice now that what I'm saying is I am pretending something is which is
But
not,
not,
or
yes.
is not and is.
Yeah.
So imagination, pretend, Piaget talked about it as well, and it emerges, lo and behold, again when you start measuring it at the same time. So now I have some internal, a pretense. I have a word referring to myself, and I have action in the world around my image. Now, if that were not enough in terms of the development of this, we then went on to start to say, well, this should impact not on the early emotions, not on fear. Fear is an action pattern. I can produce fear in a fear face and fear behavior in a very young infant that doesn't have consciousness. It's stimulus bound and it's adaptive. And there are going to be individual differences called temperament in this action pattern, but those early emotions are not.
Let's stop here for a second because we're kind of talking about something now that I want to just be clear for other people to understand. So what we've talked about is actually this recursive aspect to the sense of human consciousness, then the development of a human self in its rudimentary way, which is around the age of 2, where we can see it for sure. So we're not born with it. And then now I would like to just be clear that these 4 stages that you talked about, these 4 levels, I know, you know, and I know, you know, I know, they're kind of developmental stages, but they also have to do with different emotions. And so if you would just quickly talk about the primary emotions and the way that you understand them, the emotions that are these action patterns that are present at birth. It is hard to study them because there are different things that elicit them. There are also the facial expression stuff that Paul Ekman and Carol Izard did. Everybody thinks that's very solid, but it's actually kind of problematic too. I mean, I realize that this whole sort of arena of primary emotions, it's hard to study, but I think we don't probably need to go into all of that, but the way that you understand those primary emotions to be sorted out, and then we'll go to the secondary emotions which emerge at around this time that the self emerges. And those are these self-conscious emotions that you're so well known for, and that I'm grateful you came out with, because your way of talking and researching the self-conscious emotions, to me, helps more for all sorts of clinical things than anybody else's approach, because many people do not understand that these emotions are connected to the self. They talk about them as a social emotion. So going back to the primary emotions, then on to these self-conscious emotions, and keeping, and I'm going to kind of keep in mind the issues that these are activating patterns, and they are elicited by certain situations, and it's kind of hard to study, and the human expressions of them aren't that easy to pick out, but they can be picked out. So yes, so just the primary and then secondary emotions, and then we'll come back to the.
Well, this is a course. This would be a course that would take us probably 10, 15 lectures to round it out. So that was one of the reasons why I did the book, which I point out, which my publisher doesn't advertise. It won the William James Book Award of the American Psychological Society Award.
Great.
It was recognized, at least by some, as that. People don't buy books or read books anymore. That's another problem in our field. That's a problem in our culture. But let me take disgust for you. It's a primary emotion, but it's such a nice one because it's so immediate and it can actually be studied. And we individually differ very markedly. So let me make sure that we understand that in these action patterns, which I consider the primary emotions to be, as patterns of behavior around specific and adaptive functions, that these behaviors, Darwin spent a lot of time showing the similarity between animals and people. And in his book, equally famous is The Emotions in Man and Animals, his task was to show continuity and that these were the same. So I'm going to give you disgust because disgust isn't studied a lot. It is studied by some, but it turns out from a developmental point of view to be very important. So, for example, you can, in a 2-month-old child, take some lemon drops and put it on the child's tongue. The child will make this face. That's a disgust face. Right. I could describe it in detail. Nostrils go up, sends the upper lip up slightly. Child shows it. It's stable individual difference over the first year of life. Individuals differ. When we can look at it longitudinally, by 9 years of age, it's already in place. Again, you can use lemon or some kind of thing, and you see the same facial pattern. And I'm sure you, to me, our viewers and listeners, we all make the same kind of face for disgust. Okay? Right. Now, what has changed in this action pattern? The elicitors. To begin with, the action pattern is designed not to take in through the mouth things that smell or taste bad. This is an expelling action. As Darwin described it, it's getting it out, getting rid of it. It's around food. Yet I can talk to you about moral disgust.
Right.
Okay? What X people are doing to Y people is disgusting. Guess what? I just made the same disgust face.
Right. Yes.
So do I want to give that 2-month-old the same disgust that I feel as an adult? I don't. Does the world in general do that? They do. So that child showing the action pattern, me showing the same action pattern, but it is now based upon moral principles, not the ingestion of things that don't. So these primary emotions are action patterns. Anger. Anger is a pattern designed to overcome a barrier to a goal. It's not rage. Yeah. And the big mistake is to assume anger and rage are the same. Anger is a selected response designed to overcome a barrier to an already learned goal. So my 2-month-old has learned to pull a string to get a picture on. I allow them to do it until they know how to do it. And they're pulling away and watching the picture. And then all of a sudden, me, Michael, turns the picture off. No, turns the connection off. Now they pull and nothing happens. 80% of children show an angry face and they start pulling like crazy.
Right.
Okay. Rage is a different. Rage is a self-conscious emotion.
What I have done epistemologically, though, is to distinguish that frustration from anger as a moral emotion. So I know that I have given a number of lectures to say that anger is not the same thing as aggression or rage. And that's because I'm just using a different word for, the kind of the way the Greeks talk about animals not getting angry, they get aggressive. But it's the same thing. It's the frustration or the anger that is expressed as a primary emotion is not the same thing as rage, which is connected to humiliation.
And to destruction of
yes.
the thing that enraged you.
Yes, to destruction
Anger
also.
is only to overcome an obstacle.
Overcome an obstacle.
And you think about it in therapy, in family therapy, anger is not the inappropriate.
Right.
It's the rage
right.
that comes through humiliation.
Right.
Which in fact
is the destructive thing. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anger, fear, disgust, joy, interest, sadness. These are action patterns.
Right.
If you read Darwin's Emotions in Animals and Men, and it's 1880, I don't remember the date. Anyway,
I don't remember.
What you will see, all of the descriptions are action patterns, okay? Nothing wrong with that. You need these emotions, they're motivators, is the original idea what emotions were. Okay? They don't have to do with the self. However, once the emergence of consciousness, two things happen. Those primary emotions are now available to us.
Right.
In other words, I can fake anger with my administrators because I know I want to overcome an obstacle. Like, why are you saying this can't be done?
Right.
So I can use it now. It's instrumental. It's no longer an action pattern. It's now available to me.
Right. You can fake a smile.
That's right.
And it looks like you're actually experiencing joy, except I know there's some muscles and so on that aren't used.
No, you cannot discriminate.
Oh, really?
Paul Ekman argues for it. The data once collected and used,
wow.
And this has to do with the lying thing, which is unlikely we'll get today. But you can see why lying becomes important. Because it's another avenue from when I can look in and see what the child thinks they should be doing and what they know about these action patterns. So when our 3-year-olds lie about doing something that we know they've done, we can't discriminate between them and the truth tellers.
Yeah.
Because we're not discriminate, it turns out that if you're very good at this, you have a 10 points higher IQ than people who are not. Right. So it turns out lying and deception is a fascinating topic, but it gets to us to the same point. It begins to start to tell us what this child is capable of doing. It has imagination. What does imagination allow it to do? It has a reference to itself. It knows something about itself as different from the others, facial configuration, how tall they are. They know who to go to for different needs, etc. Any of it. So all of these primary emotions get transformed around consciousness. For animals, they are very sophisticated. They have these action patterns. There are individual differences in them. Again, let me stress, it's not the same for each organism. Some organisms will have more sadness as an action pattern. Some will have more anger. Some will have more joy. I have 2 children now. They now have grandchildren themselves. I threw one up in the air. laughed, thought it was hilarious. Don't tell my pediatrician friends. And then the other one I threw up in the air was terrified for.
Right.
I'm talking about 3-month-old. I don't mean throwing up.
Right. No,
Yeah,
I know. I know.
Physically arousing them was adversive for some. So these action patterns, these emotions have individual difference. They are not learned. No one taught you anger. They may have taught you things that make you angry. They may have taught you how to express or not express it. But anger was never taught, nor is joy taught.
Right.
You can't teach that to a child. Now,
Right.
I don't understand how they say parents who are joyful have joyful kids, and parents who are angry have angry kids, as if somehow they convey it. But
Right.
that's another story.
Right. That's
So,
another
We're
story.
going to leave the primary emotions because
Right.
people have tried to deal with them. I don't think particularly satisfying, but okay. Now let's talk about these other emotions, the consequence of consciousness, this consequence. Before I tell you that story, I'm going to tell you another story to show how screwed up we are about the words we use on these self-conscious emotions. And we are so bemuddled by our definition. So I was invited by a psychoanalytic group in New York City that meet every month to be the chief discussant to a group of psychoanalysts, and they were going to discuss the difference between shame and guilt. And there were 3 panelists and me as the discussant. And each of the panelists went and they made some statement. And then I went and I had to say, what's a nice guy like me doing in a crowd like this? And I had to say, which I said, I have great regard for psychoanalysts. My wife happens to be one as well. So, but I said, I'm here because each of these 3 people have given different definitions of the same term. And that's the truth. If you ask people with knowledge, people who are interested and read, may even write books and so on, the difference between guilt and shame, embarrassment, shyness, outcomes, all sorts of things. And then from the psychoanalytic point of view, shame turns out to be terribly important because it was actively avoided by Freud, actively avoided. And Assault on the Truth, I know the name of the book.
It was Jeffrey Mason who wrote The Assault on Truth, yes.
Freud only has one story about his father that he's told, and his father gets his hat knocked off because he's a religious Jew in Vienna in a highly anti-Semitic culture, and someone knocks his hat off in the street, and Freud responds how ashamed he is. It goes on, the whole discussion about Freud's treatment of shame, and unfortunately the whole psychoanalytic movement succumbed to it, which was the fact that he fainted 3 times in the presence of Jung.
Of Jung, yeah.
And it's quite clear that Freud assiduously avoided shame. He gave to, interestingly enough, he gave to guilt, both shame and guilt.
Right.
He talked about a good guilt and a bad guilt. The bad guilt is actually shame. But in any event, so we know that these are all somehow related, but not related. We don't know quite what to do with these. And on the positive self-conscious emotion side, we have things like pride and hubris.
Yeah.
Now, the amazing thing is, we only have one word in our English language for pride, although we have 2 concepts. Pride goeth before the fall, where pride is negative, versus and narcissistic, which will come back, or pride, which is active and specific around what one does and things.
Like the gay pride parades
Exactly.
are not supposed to be hubris. They're supposed to be a celebration. Yeah.
Exactly. So we only have one word for pride, although many languages have two. Hubris has become more popular. So I include it as along with pride, although it's somewhat hard to discriminate in terms of measurable behavior, hubris as opposed to genuine pride as a positive attribute. In any event, so here I am with some belief that to understand development, you have to understand that somewhere around the second year of life, something extraordinary happens. Now, I'll move over because we do lots of different kinds of work, and we start to do brain imaging, and it turns out that the areas associated in adults with activation, when you're making reference to yourself, is the same area in children that matures differentially, and its maturing rate is in fact related to whether we recognize themselves in mirrors or not. So now I'm now speaking in some brain biological in this story, and there's a piece of that. So I'm here on to something extraordinarily happens at 2 years of age. Now, if I believe, as I came, that the emotions themselves can be divided into primary versus secondary, then in fact, what we should see, the development, is not a moving from primary to secondary, but a movement from primary action patterns to primary action patterns and self-conscious emotions. That is, it's not a replacement, it's an addition kind of developmental view. Now that's important for those of us interested in development, because some developmental models have, as you acquire a new ability, you lose the old ability. My position is these action patterns are never lost. Maybe when we get very old, they get lost, but they're not lost. What gets added are the self-conscious emotions. Now, Darwin, here's where Darwin falls into the only difficulty in his thinking that I take, I have questions. Darwin is committed to find continuity between animals and humans because of the evolutionary theory. Man and woman does not have a unique place in the universe due to God's image. So we got to get past that. So Darwin looks at blushing as a measure of self-conscious emotion.
Right.
Unfortunately, blushing is pretty terrible because you have to be light-skinned. And he gets into trouble in dark-skinned people because he shows the prejudice of the time. He considers them halfway between the great apes and white Europeans, by the way. It makes much of it. But fundamentally, blushing doesn't help him very much. And he concludes he cannot discriminate between different kinds of these self-conscious emotions. So let's mention some of them, certainly the ones that I've been most interested in. The first one is embarrassment. It's an early one, and it is so tied to a self-representation that it was the key set of studies that made it fit for me. Embarrassment. Then guilt, not in that order. There are two kinds of embarrassment. There's an early embarrassment. There's a later embarrassment. This, by the way, is very important for pathology around shy people. And if we can, I would come back to it, because it's work that I would pick up if I had more years than I have to really work
Yeah,
on.
I would like to come back to it too, because in therapy, people go into this, I'm a sensitive person. There's this sensitive person kind of idea, shy, sensitive. So I'd like to come back to that.
Okay, well done. So there's embarrassment, and there's two kinds of embarrassment. There's an earlier embarrassment, which is related to you being the object of other people's attention.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so to just show you how embarrassment is not related to failure. We tend to say, I'm embarrassed because I didn't do something right. Get back to what right means. So I'm embarrassed. I forgot to zip myself up when I went to the bathroom. Or I got a big stain when I ate. Embarrassment, you have trouble with shame as well, because you could slide from embarrassment. But the first kind of embarrassment is being the object of another's attention. And I'll show you how it works. When you say nice things in introducing me, things that give me pleasure, I get embarrassed.
Yeah.
So the first thing we have to understand is complimenting causes embarrassment.
Embarrassment, yeah.
How? If you think about that, then embarrassment can't all be negative things.
Right.
Hey, I don't like the shirt you're wearing. Then I'm embarrassed, but this is, you say something nice and I'm embarrassed. I could go on.
Because praise often causes people to feel embarrassed. And, you know, you mentioned Japanese, and I've been in Japan a lot also, and it's really very strong there. And you don't praise people because they do become embarrassed, and so it becomes a social burden for them.
That's right. You got it. You got it. And in our studies of Japanese and American children, we can show that when a child succeeds, they show as much embarrassment as when they fail if they're Japanese. American children don't show embarrassment when they fail. They show embarrassment.
When they succeed, they show no embarrassment.
They show no.
But when they fail, they
you're absolutely on target there.
Yeah.
The second kind of embarrassment is because you have failed something. Now, so what we did was we set up an experimental situation, and we've done this several times now, in which we first determine, does the child have self-recognition, personal pronoun, imagination, pretend, and we can give values for each of them. And we can see of a child of the same age who doesn't have those yet, consciousness, and do embarrassing situations. This was a study we did back in the mid-'80s. And what we found is that children don't show embarrassment if they don't have
self-conscious. Yeah.
Okay. And they do once they have.
Right.
So there was a marker for us that said, look, here's another usefulness of the mirror studies, the conceptualization of consciousness, because when it comes in, which is our belief, due mostly to maturation of brain region associated with it, not attachment relationships, by the way,
right.
Not related, the child will show embarrassment. Embarrassment of the kind that we're talking about, that you know you are the object of others' attention, require a self-referent for me to say it and for the child to perceive it. Thus, I have evidence that, in fact, these self-conscious emotions do not emerge until you have self-recognition. A second kind of embarrassment emerges somewhat later, about a year later. So child recognizes itself in the mirror. You see if it has embarrassment, it does. However, a second kind of embarrassment emerges later, and that has to do not with that I am the object of attention, but as we do as adults, I have done something, a failure in what I call standards, rules, and goals. The idea of what the child knows about the world, and it can reflect on its behavior relative to what it knows about the world. And these become self-attributions. I attribute. Am I responsible for it? Okay, I failed or I succeeded. Am I responsible or not responsible? Why would that be important as a dimension? You win the lottery. Polly, are you proud or are you happy that you won? You're not proud.
No, you'd be happy if you knew that. If you knew that, because it's a luck. It's a matter of luck. It wasn't your own. Okay? You didn't cause it. It wasn't.
It turns out one way to get out of embarrassment, out of shame and guilt, is to say it's not my fault.
Right.
And in my earlier book on shame and in subsequent work, it turns out it's a device that men are more likely to use than women, starting at 3 years of age and going to 6 or 7. Women show more shame than men, but women do not show more pride than men. They show equal. And one of the things we know, if you're with a partner, with a male partner, rather than a female partner, it is often, I don't think it's gender related necessarily, but that's another story. I will say, gee, I'm sorry, but it wasn't my fault.
Right.
Or better yet, I'm driving down a dark road, it's raining, and a dog jumps in front. Clearly, I'm someone's pet. I hit and kill it. And my first reaction is, oh, what a terrible thing I did. If I make another attribution, it was my fault, and I make a third attribution, this is a reflection of me, the total me. Shame is the consequence.
Right.
Guilt leaves out that it is totally me that's at fault. It says, I have to remember never to drive that fast again, or some other things. But there's another way to get out of self-conscious emotion, to simply convert the shame to blame.
Oh, yes.
Shame, blame.
It's your fault.
Is an extraordinary connection. So now I've killed this dog. I'm feeling terrible. I don't want to feel terrible. And so I say, what's wrong with those people? They let their dog out.
Right.
It's not my fault.
Right.
It's those people killed their dog, right?
Right.
That's how you get out of shame, by converting the shame by not blaming yourself.
Right.
Women get out of pride by saying anyone could do it. Chance. Okay? Men, for shame, get out of it by blaming others. Women, for pride, get out of it by blaming, essentially, or not saying.
And so that's really a male-female difference that you found was very robust in little kids, even. I mean,
you see it emerging even prior to adolescence. So, I mean, I see it in school-age kids already.
Well, that's a very interesting finding.
So, what I'm saying is consciousness emerges. It allows me to make reference to myself. It allows me to know something about my knowledge of how the world works. Whether my parents reinforced certain things or didn't, however we may want to look at it, okay? I like to give my personal example. I had a test in high school in chemistry. I got 97. I came home. I said to my father, look how I'm doing. He said to me, typical of an achievement, ending up an achievement male, he said to me, what happened to the 3 points? Okay, now, that's your tiger mom, that's your Jewish mom, however we phrase it, it's parents holding high standards. So I'm going through the world with a standard differently than a kid who just passes and the parent says, wow, you passed. What do you care? So 60, that person feels, gets a C, I get an A minus or an A, and I'm unhappy because I don't have 100 and they're happy. So part of the knowledge now of what success and failure is, that's socialized.
Yeah.
The process by which I have a set of goals, set of rules, set of standards, what I'm calling the society or the family that I'm in, and I will make a judgment, not on all things, because I don't know all things, on some things, that if I succeed, I will compare. How do I know I succeed? Because I have a standard, I have my own behavior, and say, hey, that matches. Okay, I can then say, was I responsible or not for it? And thirdly, I can say, is this reflecting upon me as a human or some attribute of me? What is called a global self-evaluation or a specific.
Yeah.
Okay, and the attributional literature is full of understanding of these things. So it was easy to export from that a set of criteria, including you're walking around with knowledge that some things are going to get rewarded or punished, some things are good or bad, that your mother thinks they're good, your father thinks they're bad, however you're going to cope with knowledge in the world. You come to decide on responsibility. Is it, did I want to do that? Was it an accident? Was it on purpose? Parents often say to their children, when they say it was an accident, and the child says it was an accident, parents say, well, if you did it on purpose, we would put you in jail. It still doesn't excuse you. So you get bad parenting, where in fact you say, you never do an accident. Or you're married to a psychoanalyst who says, there's no such thing as not having a unconscious motive and so on. But you now start to get to defenses if you can describe how these emotions appear. So guilt, the difference between guilt and shame is very simple. You in guilt focus on what was wrong vis-a-vis your standards. Whereas shame, you're focusing on you as doing wrong.
Yes, doing wrong. Right, right.
So there's the specific. Guilt has retribution as a way of becoming not guilty.
And what about reparation also? I mean, does guilt
pro-social behavior and guilt are highly correlated.
Are highly correlated. And so then the thing that I wanted to get to that is just the last piece of this, because it's really the reason I initially reached out, is this issue about shame and the ways in which now this is kind of a big leap here, but there's been a huge increase in suicides in people between 10 and 34 years old. 10 and 34. It's ended up being, the second major cause of death in that age group after accidents. And in my work clinically, and in a lot of the interviews I've done and so on, there's a real concern about perfectionism in young adults and even in teenagers, children, and then suicide that may be impulsive even, based on having standards that are impossible to meet, evaluating the self, I believe, negatively. And then you have mental health professionals who think that's depression and start to treat it with an antidepressant, which may even promote more action that could lead to suicide. I'm kind of putting a whole thing together here. But that issue of being able to recognize something that is motivated by shame, a shame-based disorder, or the kind of evaluation of the self that is shame-based versus depression. And it seems that there are many mental health professionals, psychoanalysts, cognitive behaviorists, and so on, who do not make that distinction. Psychiatrists also particularly, because they're treating with medication. And I find that certain medications, Lexapro, sometimes Prozac, are not a good match for this. So I just wondered if there's any way that we can take all of this self-conscious self and shame and so on. And
I have an essay that I recently wrote on this rise in expectations and are critical. It's quite clear that there is a connection, and perhaps it would be helpful to consider consider a couple of things, and let's do this quickly. One, that the most powerful negative emotion that I think humans possess is shame. We know from studying its biology that cortisol secretion is highly associated with being shamed. And we've done work, others have done as well. So what we have is maybe evolved an idea that, listen, I want you to stop whatever you have done, and I don't want you to do it again. And so I'm going to give you this thing called shame, and it stops you in your tracks. Indeed, the clinical setting, if you start looking at the production of shame in the clinical setting, you can actually watch collapse of the body, cessation of regard, disruption in speech patterns, and the increase in personal pronoun use. I did a lot of work years ago in Australia with the self-psychologists and psychoanalysts there. And it was quite amazing in the videotapes that they took of where the patient experienced shame and so on. It's enormously powerful. Guilt, on the other hand, is not. Guilt does not stop Eichmann from continuing to ship off the Jews to be killed in the concentration camp.
Right.
You need shame. You need something that says, you stop what you're doing. This is really hurting you. Now, you've got this powerful inhibitor, and it gets produced. And what is likely to get you to focus on your global self?
Right.
I believe that what has happened in this culture is a self-focusing culture. Tattoos, selfies.
Identity, a lot of identity stuff, me.
Is on the line all the time. And this essay is about essentially where did behaviors appropriate behaviors that we should do come from. That is etiquette. It was about the death of etiquette and the rise of self and interpersonal relationships.
Right.
You can see this in lying all the time.
Yeah.
One person has an affair with someone else, and the most serious offense in that is you lied to me, as opposed that you committed some kind of moral, if you will, outrage and so on. What has happened is as we focus more on the self, which has been an increase in the last 50 years, and the literature shows this, the decrease in happiness, the increase in expectation and requirements.
And shame, I guess, you know, the more
shame.
Shame, yeah.
Fundamentally, how do you get out of shame? You can get out of it by depression, because being depressed turns out to be less painful than being shameful.
Yeah.
Although they're being driven by the same I as a thing is no good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And will never be good, of course.
Right.
You need that perspective versus narcissism, which is it's never my fault. We just elected a man who was a narcissist personified.
Right.
His whole his lying, his exaggeration, shame is the underside of narcissism. I've used the phrase. It's in the book.
Because guilt wasn't the issue. The issue was shame.
It's shame. I'm no good.
Right. And so
something was no good.
But as you've said many times, shame motivates you to hide, to lie, to cover up, or to die. So dying is one of the options for, you know, to stop the shame.
And as you know, what's the gender differences?
You've said in schools that girls feel shame more for, I can't remember exactly, but I know there's a difference between girls and boys.
There is a difference in girls and boys. The suicide may not reflect that difference. I don't really.
Oh, in the suicide right now, young males are make more serious attempts and commit suicide more effectively and more often than the young females. So the males will use more potent methods, you know, jumping off a building or hanging themselves or a gun, and the girls will use something that would be more like taking pills and so on.
Right. Interestingly, the difference in terms of depression, with a sex difference in depression, certainly favors females, unfortunately, in depression. They're not using, actually, depression is a substitute for the shame. So what I'm talking about is shame has a shame blame, and it can be an external blame or an internal blame.
Yeah.
So that sometimes the depression is in fact being generated by shame.
I know that it can be, and yet what I see happening diagnostically and in terms of treatments is that there's a mistake about that the shame often is the issue is an attack on the self based on impossible expectations that the individual has failed to meet. And then if that's treated with a medication, the medication will fail and it will be another shame. That individual will say, you know, I can't even be treated by medication. Like I can't be helped because what I have is something that sets me aside from other people and I cannot be helped. And if that mental health professional does not understand a shame-based, even if you want to call it a depression, a shame-based disorder, the mental health professional will tend to unknowingly contribute to the sense of failure in the individual because that individual is not being helped by anything and then the individual thinks, well, it's me, you know, they can't.
I think you're absolutely right. I did on the book, which are data now quite a few years old, look at what shames people, just ask them. And you find for women, the two top items are, in fact, physical attractiveness and failure in interpersonal relationships. Males, the two are potency, sexual potency, and achievement. And indeed, Goffman and others have pointed out when the female, in fact, gives up in the relationship, because it is usually she who apologizes, and male-female couples, couples of other types and descriptions. I don't know. I can't speak to, but in fact, then the relationship ends. So I suspect that these are such global features of the self that they're very powerful, and that the conversion to move away from shame. So when I speak to students and try to get them to talk about shame, I find it absolutely impossible until I discovered that I don't talk about shame. I talk about them. I'll talk about them with embarrassment. What embarrasses you? And then get them to start talking about it. But with some of my graduate students, now clinical professionals, we did studies at 7 and 8 and 9-year-old girls and boys, large numbers of them, about body parts, rating body parts. We asked girls and boys to rate, but there's a name for this under your own, this thing that gets flabby as you get older, okay? Boys don't even know where it is. Girls already have an opinion about it, whether they have too much or not. Boys during adolescence, all of the changes are viewed as positive. Women, young women, the changes in adolescence and puberty are really quite horrible in some sense. Menstruation being the next 30, 40 years, being an extraordinary event for women that has to be full of shame, and especially given what most cultures' feeling is toward sexual relations during menstruation and so on. So, I mean, you're going to get differences.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that we've been able to show that 3 and 4-year-olds use these attributional processes, and that when we manipulate them. So to give you an example, if I gave you a hard problem and you failed it, or I gave you an easy problem and you failed it, which one would you feel more shame for?
The easy one.
That's right. If I gave you an easy one and you succeeded, and a hard one and you succeeded, which one? The hard one.
Yeah.
Well, at 3 years of age, when you manipulate those dimensions, you find 3-year-olds shifting their pride and shame, depending upon whether it was labeled easy or difficult. And we control whether they succeed or fail by adjusting the amount of time we give them. So unbeknownst to the child or the adolescent, we're giving them a couple of minutes to complete a task. And if we want them to succeed, we let the clock go. They can't tell we're doing it. And the bell goes off after they've succeeded, finished, so they're called success. If the bell goes off before, it indicates they failed. The same if it's easy task, success and fail. So we can manipulate these things, and early in the game, 3 or 4-year-olds, preschool kids are already using self-attribution based on their ability to have a representation of themselves, what we've been calling consciousness, which then generates and moves them into these self-conscious emotions. They are really at the heart human, because animals have action patterns, which we could call anger and fear, but they don't have shame and guilt.
That's right.
So the vast majority of pet owners believe their cats are guilty and their dogs are ashamed of things they do. And
Yeah.
it turns out when you do the right experiments, they're not really, but
Right.
and it's an argument in the field all the time. And so,
Yeah.
you know, someone will raise their hand in a lecture that I'll give, public lecture, and they say, "Are you telling me my dog is not ashamed when
I know.
And it lowers its head and puts its tail?" And I say, "Yes, I'm sure you think a dog is ashamed, but what if the dog went and went for you when you yelled at it? That dog wouldn't live very long." So dogs have evolved that when they are scolded by the people who take care of them, they're supposed to lower their heads.
They're submissive. Yeah.
And
They're
be
submissive.
So
Yes.
there are the studies. I mean, too much to go into.
What I feel is so important in your work is this connection of the emotions to the self and the consciousness of self, and the ways that those are connected developmentally, the fact that they're both hardwired and situational, and that we can see them early and they evolve through life. It's a way of understanding the meaning of the human self that I don't think anybody else actually offers so directly in their work. And it's a continuation of Darwin, it's a continuation of William James, of Piaget, but you've taken it to, I think, a much more, let's say, refined and precise conversation about what it means to be human. So, I really enjoy talking to you, and I hope I haven't exhausted you in this process, but it's been fun for me, and I'm very grateful, not just for talking to you, but for your work over the years, Michael.
Well, thank you so much, Polly. It's always rewarding to when bright and creative people find something of merit in what you've spent 60 years doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so I hope to see you again sometime
I hope
soon. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.